Venue today, Made in Stirling, which showcases amazing artistic talent from across the constituency. Spaces like this give a real vibrancy to our high streets and support our fantastic creative arts sector. So I'm delighted to welcome Lorna and Patrick to launch our campaign here, and I look forward to inviting them back to Stirling soon to join me on the campaign trail. They have led the Scottish Greens to record results in the Holyrood and council elections. They became the first Greens in the UK to enter government, and they continue to lead this party from strength to strength. Please welcome Lorna Slater.
Thank you everyone for coming today. On Friday, I was delighted to announce that the Scottish Greens would be standing in 44 constituencies. That is a record for our party. With our candidates like Andrew now in place and our volunteers out speaking to voters across Scotland this weekend, we are formally launching our campaign today. We are asking you and people across Scotland to vote like your future depends on it. The climate crisis is intensifying. We can all see it now. Just look at the last year. Every single one of the last 12 months has broken temperature records. We have all become used to the tragedies that extreme weather is reaping across the globe. We need an exit ramp off the highway to climate hell. That's what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said last week. Such a stark warning. A warning that reflects the severity of the climate crisis and the urgent need for bold climate leadership. Yet already in this campaign, the SNP and Labour are U-turning on climate commitments. They promise voters that they are serious about climate action while drawing up PFI contracts to duel the highway to climate hell. In this election, it is only the Scottish Greens who are providing a real alternative. It is the Greens who are being honest with voters about the reality of the climate crisis and what we must do to build a modern, green and fair Scotland. It's the Greens who are providing hope. Setting out a vision that would see us grasp the opportunity and deliver the transition to a green economy. At its most basic, that means two actions. Firstly, we must invest at the scale and pace needed in the solutions to the climate emergency. And secondly, we must phase out what's causing the climate emergency: fossil fuels. Over the coming weeks, we will set out the details of our plans to invest in renewables and the green industries of the future. Right now, I want to point to our record. Making promises is the easy part. But unlike other parties, the Scottish Greens follow through and deliver what we said we would. We have achieved for people and for planet. The Scottish Greens have led the UK in helping families reduce their energy bills and switching to greener home heating sources. We introduced the most generous subsidies in the UK for households to invest in energy efficiency and renewable heat systems like heat pumps. We invested in our public transport system, brought the Caledonian Sleeper into public ownership as well as ScotRail. We scrapped peak rail fares and made bus travel for all children and young people free. You'll notice that some of these policies, green policies brought to the table and secured by the Scottish Greens, have proven so popular that now the SNP are trying to claim them as their own. We delivered record investment in restoring Scotland's natural environment and in making our streets safe for walking, wheeling and cycling. We won government commitments to double onshore wind, expand solar power almost tenfold, reformed the planning system to make renewables development easier and quicker, and we secured investment into the Scottish supply chain. Decisive action to not just tackle the climate emergency, but to make Scotland a better, fairer, and more prosperous country. We also took action to phase out fossil fuels. With Greens in government, Scotland, the country that helped bring the coal-fired revolution to the world, adopted a position to support no coal or oil and gas extraction on land, ending any prospect that these industries could be revived. That is what the Greens do. We do it at every level of government. In Edinburgh, for example, Scottish Green councillors last month succeeded in banning advertising from fossil fuel companies and other high-carbon industries on council-owned advertising spaces like buses and billboards. This is a significant development. Advertising plays a big role in driving forward unsustainable consumption and legitimizing those companies that are destroying the planet for profit. That's why the UN last week called for all countries to ban coal, oil and gas companies from advertising, just as tobacco advertising was banned. The Scottish Greens would do just that. Decisive action to tackle the climate emergency. That's what's needed, and that is what is at stake in this election. Yet Starmer, Sunak and Swinney have all been clear that they're either too scared to rise to this opportunity or too invested in the status quo. Starmer had dumped his key commitment to invest in the green economy before the campaign had even started. And now he can't make up his mind as to what his much-promised GB energy company actually is. It'll create 50,000 jobs. No, 70,000. No, 100,000, depending on what day of the week it is. It'll be an energy company, but it won't generate energy. Oh, it will generate energy. Oh, no, it's an investment company. It changes every day because they don't know what GB Energy is, and they don't seem to care enough to work out the details. While John Swinney appears to have overseen a U-turn on his party's position on oil and gas, now his party is telling scare stories to stop some of the world's biggest polluters from paying windfall taxes. I said that the Scottish Greens will always be honest about what the climate crisis means. So here it is. Issuing new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea flies in the face of science and what the experts are advising. 60% of fossil fuels worldwide need to be left in the ground. And even the International Energy Agency have said that there can be no new investment in fossil fuels if we are to avoid catastrophic levels of climate change. So when the Deputy First Minister says, we're not against new oil and gas licenses and we've never said no, she's not just rewriting history, she is leading Scotland in a shameful retreat. It wasn't long ago that Scotland offered genuine climate leadership to the world at COP26 in Glasgow. Now the SNP are back to the inward-looking and conservative instincts of, it's Scotland's oil. We all understand why this is happening. It's easier to bury your head in the sand than to face challenges squarely. But that doesn't make it any less disappointing or dangerous. This is the message that our campaign will bring to the doorsteps across Scotland. Our future depends on this election. Don't waste your vote on parties who hide their head in the sand. Don't waste it on politicians too invested in the status quo to offer the change they promise you. We are running out of time. But there is still hope, and you have the power to make a difference. A vote for the Scottish Greens is a vote for decisive action to tackle the climate emergency and build a fair and green Scotland. Vote like your future depends on it. Vote Scottish Greens. Thank you very much. And now I am delighted to introduce my great friend and fellow co-leader, Patrick Harvey.
Thanks ever so much, Lorna. I think we're probably all aware that the last 14 years has seen a sustained attack on our public services and on our communities by Tory austerity. It's been an ideology that has systematically stripped funding out of the public sector and handed it to big corporations and to the super rich. We've faced the greatest cost of living crisis for a generation, and it's been dramatically worsened by the disaster of Trussonomics. It's sent mortgages, rent and food prices skyrocketing. It's eroded the value of the pound in your pocket. And this lethal combination of Tory ideology and Tory incompetence has brought public services to their knees. And we're now being told, both by the Conservatives and by Labour, that the only way to fix this is to tighten our belts even more. That means more cuts to already struggling public services, less support for struggling households across the country. We're being told there's no money to scrap the abhorrent two-child benefit cap or to pay every worker at least a real living wage. We're being told there's no money for a proper green investment plan, but somehow there's always enough money for nuclear weapons. And ideally, that's when the thing crashes. I'll go back to the old tech. The Scottish Greens are here to say that the idea there's no money left simply isn't true. It doesn't have to be this way. The UK is one of the richest countries in the history of the world. But that wealth is massively concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite. So it's time for a fundamental shift in how we manage our economy, to create a system that works for people and for planet. That starts with how we raise money for our essential public services. Now, here in Scotland, thanks to the Scottish Greens, we already have a fairer income tax system, one where people on low incomes pay a bit less than elsewhere in the UK, while those who can afford to pay a bit more. That progressive tax policy has not only helped make the system fairer, it's raising an extra £1.5 billion every year for our public services. Replicating that fairer income tax policy across the whole of the UK would cut tax for millions of low-income families while raising an additional £11 billion for public services. Vital funds for more nurses, doctors, teachers. Why on earth wouldn't Labour follow our lead on this? But earlier this year, the same Labour Party that claims there's no money available to scrap the two-child limit and lift 10,000 children out of poverty actually had its MSPs vote against a Green measure to increase tax just on the top 5% of earners. Taxing income on its own, high income, isn't enough. To put our public services on a sustainable footing, to deliver the public service and the levels of infrastructure investment that the country needs, we have to broaden the tax base. We have to tax the extreme wealth of the super rich. The Greens are proposing a wealth tax that would target just the top 1% of people. That's people with asset wealth of more than £3.4 million. People who can well afford to pay their way and contribute more to public services. Starting with a base rate of 1% and rising to 10% for the very wealthiest, that's people with wealth over £18.2 million, this tax would raise at least £70 billion a year for public services. This is the kind of bold, redistributive policy that the country urgently needs if we're serious about delivering modern, fit-for-purpose public services, eradicating poverty, and investing in public infrastructure on the scale that's needed. But only the Scottish Greens are honest enough to propose this. Now, putting the wealth of the country back to work to rebuild public services and invest for the future instead of leaving it hoarded by those who are in the least need, that's one way of making our society a fairer place and more equal. But equality is about more than just money. Everyone deserves to live in a society where they feel valued. But for years now, the UK government hasn't just failed to build that kind of inclusive society, it has actively undermined it. At times it feels as though the Conservative Party simply can't see a marginalised, vulnerable minority without instinctively punching down. It's been clearest, of course, in relation to LGBTQ people, with a level of targeted hostility that now goes beyond anything from the days of Section 28. But we're seeing it too in their attitude to young people. Instead of affordable homes to live in, Rishi Sunak's party thinks they need to be sent off on national service. And we see the same attitude in relation to economic migration, where people with the drive and determination to make a life for themselves in this country and who have a contribution to make are forced to endure ever more Kafkaesque bureaucracy to be allowed to be here. The latest example is the threat of ever-rising salary thresholds for spouse visas, literally tearing families apart in order to appease the immigration obsessions of the far right. And it's even more brutal in relation to asylum, with some of the most vulnerable people in the world subject to the most degrading treatment. Hundreds of millions of pounds spent on the Rwanda plan to deport asylum seekers before they'd even had their cases heard. None of these marginalised people are the cause of this country's problems. They are being targeted by Rishi Sunak's Conservatives in a cynical attempt to distract people from the real causes of the country's problems: Tory cruelty, Tory incompetence, and Tory corruption. The Greens would end this bullying culture war agenda immediately. And it's critical to have Green voices in Parliament challenging it, because many of these targeted groups should be deeply worried that Labour seem to threaten more of the same, from anti-immigrant rhetoric to transphobia. We are clear about the scale of the real challenges this country faces. We know that our vision for real climate action, for a fairer economy, for a compassionate approach to refugees, none of this is a priority either for Labour or for the Conservatives. Together, they have created a political climate in which these things are seen as impossible, and in which even more extreme right-wing forces are able to find opportunity. Progressive ideas threaten the status quo. And as we all saw when we were in government, vested interests in Scotland and across the UK don't take this lying down. Delivering the change that voters and the country so desperately need will take determination and commitment. Determination and commitment that seem entirely absent from Keir Starmer's Labour Party. A Labour Party that promises a change of government but without a change of politics. We're going to wake up to a new Prime Minister on July the 5th, but we'll still have austerity and Brexit and the hostile environment. Whether it's Labour or the Conservatives in Downing Street, though, Scotland is being held back in delivering the change that we need. Worse, recent years have shown that Westminster is perfectly happy to interfere even in devolved areas in Scotland against the will of the Scottish Parliament and Government with no democratic mandate. That's why Scottish Green activists and candidates across the country will be making the case for Scotland's future as an independent country in the EU. Our manifesto will set out how we would use the powers currently reserved to Westminster to create a fairer future for all, but we know the only likely way we can deliver those plans is for Scotland to be able to choose its own way. And that starts by Westminster granting the Scottish Parliament the power to hold constitutional referendums so the people of Scotland can make their choice about their future at a time of their choosing. The next UK government must be under immediate and sustained, unrelenting pressure to make this change. It's our fundamental democratic right, and it can't be denied any longer. So when we ask you to vote like your future depends on it, we really do mean it. The Scottish Greens are offering a future where we can prevent climate breakdown. A future where our economy works for everyone, not just the wealthy. A future where we look after those who come to us for refuge and for safety. And a future as an independent Scottish Republic. So join us. And on the 4th of July, vote Scottish Green. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to everyone who made it along to Stirling today. That concludes the end of the event for just now, but a couple of housekeeping points. If some of our excellent candidates could stick around up here for a second, we'll get some group photos up the front. I believe Patrick, Lorna and Andrew will be available for some media, so if that takes place up here, that would be great. And for everyone else, if you're up for it, we're going to go out and knock some doors, get some votes for Andrew just now. So if you want to meet out the front of the shop at 10:45, we'll head off knocking some doors over in Riverside. Thanks very much.